sharing for now, and then.
Usually it takes a little bit. It has to think for a little bit. So. Okay, so we should be live and all set. So we got about 2.5 minutes to go.
Okay.
And I will paste that in the chat.
And Ben, I think I'll mention that at the end as well. And if you can throw that again in the chat at the end. Just for anybody that comes in late. I don't know if they can see the extent of the chat.
Yes. Okay. Looks like we are getting through to everyone, so that is great. And I will resume recording. So at this point, we should be all good to go.
Okay, just let me know when to start.
Oh, and just so you're aware, there is about like a 20-second delay or so between you and when it comes out on the live stream.
Sounds good.
Okay, why don't we get started? I will mute myself and feel free to get rolling.
Sounds good. Sorry, I will be right with you. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the first talk of the 2021 Science Expeditions. My name is Dave Lovelace. I am a vertebrate paleontologist at the University of Wisconsin's Geology Museum. And I'm going to say right at the beginning, there are a number of talks this year that are being hosted online, and you can find the link in the YouTube chat, and from there peruse the options and definitely check out some of the more of the talks today and tomorrow this weekend. So I'm going to say, as I go through this, if you have any questions, go ahead and enter them into the chat. My colleague, Brooke Norstead, who's the assistant manager at the Geology Museum, is paying attention to those and is going to kind of queue it up and help moderate some of the questions towards the end of the talk. I will do that. I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions. What we're going to start, I'll just kind of walk through some slides and do a little presentation. And from there, we'll just kind of open it up to a discussion and see what we can chat about and what kind of questions come up. As a vertebrate paleontologist, I'm going to say I grew up in Wyoming, and what I'm going to talk today about is actually some specimens that I collected long ago and worked on for a number of years. And it's a series of vertebra, and that kind of got me interested in paleontology and really got me diving into the science. It was super exciting. So I kind of want to share that story a little bit and some of the story of these bones. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, give you a presentation started here. All right. So as this gets going, I'm going to pull this up so I can see this. get all our logistics situated. All right, so here we are, Virtual Journey, a story of a dinosaur backbone. So in 1996 is when I first started working some dinosaur sites in Wyoming. And the first site that I worked extensively was one known as the Jimbo Quarry. The Jimbo Quarry is kind of now becoming a little bit more famous. There's only 2 dinosaurs from it, but it happens to be that it preserved the biggest dinosaur, or really now the longest dinosaur in the world, one of the biggest. There's some really cool big dinosaurs coming out of South America right now, so pay attention to that as they come up in the headlines. So the longest dinosaur in North America, and we had one of the smallest dinosaurs from North America as well. We found the smallest one as an accident because we're digging up this gigantic animal. We're removing a whole lot of rock, and in the rock above it, we actually found a little tiny, which is pretty cool, big one. And I will show you what Jimbo is. There we go. So Jimbo, this is the mount of a skeleton. We made replicas of the bones because they were too big to mount and too delicate. So we made replicas and then effectively modeled the rest of the animal for the pieces that we didn't have. We had about 30% of the skeleton, which in vertebrate paleontology, when you're dealing with big dinosaurs, 30% of an animal, a third of the animal, is actually a lot. And it's very critical about its life and about its history. So we were excited once we finally got that all excavated and able to be mounted. And it only took us about 15 years. It takes a long time to excavate giant dinosaurs, it turns out. And moreover, it takes a long time to clean up their bones, which is something that we do a lot at the UW-GM, where we're working a lot on cleaning up some big dinosaur bones from the same time period, which, if we look at the time scale, the last 500 million years here, here lower in the Paleozoic, I'm going to be focusing on a Jurassic animal. Of the Mesozoic period. To get us started, and so I'm going to talk about the dinosaur family tree. And this is effectively a simplified version of the dinosaur family tree with skeletal drawings that were actually done by Dr. Scott Hartman, who is also at the University of Wisconsin. He's in the integrated biology department. He and I have been colleagues and working on these things in '96, so we've known each other for quite a while and been working on these dinosaur family skeletals. I'd like to show you effectively, if you look at this diagram up at the top, it's showing a way of showing relationships. And so we would read animals B and C more closely to each other than B, C, A bind the blocks. Those are all closely related to each other than are to any of the animals. So it's a nested hierarchy. Okay, in that, look at birds.
Hi, everybody. So it looks like we're having some connectivity issues here with our presenter, unfortunately. So we'll have to pause here for a second, and hopefully he will be back on shortly and can continue his his presentation. So I'm sorry about that. Hopefully that'll get revised quickly. So please stay with us. I'm sure he'll be back soon, and we can get back rolling with learning about some of the dinosaurs that he has studied.
We had a momentary glitch. It looks like my internet.
So hopefully we will have him back shortly. It looks like his Wi-Fi might have dropped out. So please just stay with us, and hopefully he'll get back shortly.
Hi, everyone. Let's see if I can figure out what's going on here. Of course, during the entire pandemic, everything was going fine. And the one time I'm giving a talk to you all, it decides to crash on us. So let's see if we can roll with it. I'm going to make sure that I am sharing my screen again. Get the chat going. And we'll keep rolling with this. All right. Hopefully we've not lost everybody. Sorry, just waiting for confirmation. I'm going to just turn my video off here. Yay. All right. Sounds good. So we got the screen going. Everything's going. Here we go. Dinosaur family tree. So if we look at, here we go. The dinosaur family tree blown up a little bit. We have three groups of dinosaurs. The first group is the ornithischians, and those are the, they're called bird hip dinosaurs because their shape of their hip looks like a bird, but ironically, bird hip dinosaurs actually derive from a group of theropods, which belong to a larger group called saurischians, which as a whole are including the sauropods and theropods, and they have a dinosaur, or they have a hip that looks a little bit more like a lizard's hip. The group that we're going to be focusing on, though, is this particular sauropod, supersaurus, right here. And supersaurus is very long. It's kind of one of these unusual dinosaurs. It's a long-necked, long-tailed critter, and it looks very much like a brontosaurus or a patasaurus or diplodocus. They're very closely related. They're in that same group of dinosaurs. And it's noteworthy for its extremely long neck. And so if we compare necks of the longest necked dinosaurs in the world, this gives us kind of a lineup. So Diplodocus, which is very similar to a Apatosaurus and Barosaurus, those long-necked dinosaurs from the Jurassic that are so classic. And then Sauroposeidon, which is a type of brachiosaur. And here is Supersaurus. So you can see its neck extends almost 15 meters, longer than a typical school bus. So very long neck. And what we want to understand is, by looking at these bones, what can we tell about it? I mean, great, it's a long neck, but what else is going on? So we're just going to walk through some of the bones, and then we'll start talking about a little bit of the unique features that are seen within the features of those bones. So this is a cervical vertebra. It's a neck bone. And there are 12 neck bones that make up a supersaurus neck. And one of the things I want to kind of point out is a sense of scale. So an Apatosaurus and a Diplodocus, those are the animals like these, B and C. And those are the typical Jurassic long-necked dinosaurs. And Supersaurus has a neck that's over twice as long. Each vertebra of one of those animals in the neck bones. Dorsal vertebra, those are the backbones. Those are the ones that actually hold all the body ribs. And then there's the tailbones or the caudal vertebra. And so the tailbones, there's over 80 tailbones in Supersaurus. That's what gives it its really long whip-like tail. So the vertebra have some unique features which are really cool, and you can start to see some of them in the pictures here. And I'll point out some of the basic features, the structure, if you will, of the bone. And it really holds true for all vertebrae, not just dinosaurs. Fish have these same structures in many respects, structures that are very, very similar. They're going to start off with a body of the vertebra or the centrum. Okay, so this is the thing that really sticks together and makes up the pieces that lock together at the base of the vertebrae. And there is a hole, the neural canal, and that's where the spinal cord goes. And so that hole, and all vertebrae have some sort of rib. And sometimes they develop, and they're the full ribs that we see in the body that we think of as ribs, and then reduced. And so this image that we're seeing over here on the right, this guy, these little pieces sticking out on the side, those are actually ribs. So this is a cervical rib or a neck bone rib. Okay. And then lastly, we have the spine. And so we talk about our spine as a collective, all of the bones in our backbone, but the spine are actually the little spinous process. They're the piece that stick up. So if you put your hand on the back of your back, on your backbone, you can feel those little bumps running up and down. Those are the spines. That is the neural spine of each vertebra that you're feeling as you feel those bumps going down your back. Okay. Now, we're going to step away from vertebra for just a second. And interestingly, we need to start talking about lungs. And what I want to point out is that the way that we breathe, the way that mammals breathe, is very different than the way archosaurs, animals like crocodiles and dinosaurs and birds breathe. It's very different. So first, when we take in a breath, we fill our lungs with fresh air, and the air goes into these little tiny sacs in the lung, and blood flows over it, and that oxygen gets diffused into the blood, and CO2 is diffused out, and your lungs start to get a bunch of CO2 rich air, which is not what we want. We want oxygen rich air, right? So we have to expel it. So there is a chunk of our chest tube, that is our trachea, that has CO2 in it. So when we breathe in again, we're bringing in a little bit of that bad air and transmitting that through our lungs again, but it still has enough oxygen. Obviously, we breathe, we live, it does fine. But that's it. It's a two-way system. Air goes in all the way into the lungs, it expands out, and then it compresses out a little bit and then comes back in. So air goes into the lungs and out of the lungs. Now, that two-way system is not as efficient as it could be, but it works for us. Works good enough anyway, right? Bird lungs are a little bit of a different story. They have a one-way street effectively through the lungs. So air comes in, it fills up these posterior air sacs, and I'll get my mouse moving here. So down here in the back, these yellow, it fills up those air sacs, but at the same time it's filling it up, some of the air goes into the lungs. And then when the animal respires, when it sends air out, it exhales, those air sacs collapse and push new fresh air through the lungs. So even when it breathes in, some fresh air goes into the lungs and into the air sacs. When it breathes out, fresh air goes into the lungs from the air sacs. And so that in that way, only fresh air goes through the lungs. And as it goes through the lungs, the countercurrent of blood going through the vessels along that same path are pulling up oxygen and transmitting out CO2. And so it exhales CO2, inhales clean, fresh air. So it's a really efficient system. And this is super cool, right? That's one of the reasons that birds can fly at altitudes thousands and thousands of feet above us. I mean, they can fly over Mount Everest. It's pretty impressive what birds can do, in part because they have this one-way breathing system in their lungs. Now, what's really interesting is whenever we look at crocodiles, who I don't tend to think of as being super athletic and hyper efficient with their breathing system, but they too have a one-way breathing system. So these are, this is a picture of a CT scan of a crocodile with the lungs highlighted there. And you can see all the little air sacs towards the back that are able to bring in air and push it through the lungs in inhalation and in exhalation when it breathes in and out. So now that we can see we have this kind of one-way breathing system in bird lungs, this bird line, and we have that one-way breathing system in crocodiles. Now there's a really cool concept in biology called extant phylogenetic bracketing. And basically what that means is if your ancestor has a condition and your descendants have that same morphological condition, almost certainly the group in between you would have that same condition. So it's pretty cool. So crocodiles have one-way breathing, birds have one-way breathing. Guess what? Dinosaurs almost certainly had one-way breathing. And it's the backbones that help to tell the story of this. So with these backbones, what I want to do is show, this is a tailbone right here, and this is a neck bone. And we're going to point out a couple more features here. The first one, you can see these, I'll go back. You can see these holes right here in the vertebral body right there. Those are they're holes, they go into the bone, and that's called a nematopore, or it's an air window. Basically, it's where air sacs actually invade inside the bone. And it's pretty cool because it makes the bones super light and hollow, right? Because all this air is now taking up space on the inside. The other thing is see these big pockets, these big divots in the bones? Those are also filled with air sacs. So anytime as an animal grows, its air sac, or part of the lung system in birds and even in some in crocodiles, you can see the interaction between the tissue in the lungs actually affects how the bone grows. And so we can compare dinosaur bones to those of birds and see that the smooth features that you see on those surfaces are actually the same kind of texture that you see when they grow next to air sac tissue. So we know that these are, they would have contained air sacs, and those depressions are called a pleurocoel. It's a hollow depression, and they're abundant in the cervical and the neck bones, and in the back bones, and in the very first part of the tailbones. And so you can see kind of an image here up in the right, these are where all those little pockets of the air sac would be filling up the space around the bone. And if we turn the bone and we look at it straight on, like we're looking at it down the neck, that's what this is over here. And you can see these blue areas. That's the air sac. And on the outside of the air sac is the musculature that helps hold the neck together and allows it to move and such. But inside that is filled with this air space, which is significant. When you have a neck that is 15 meters long, it would be really hard to pull in enough air in a two-way system like a mammal and push it all the way back out. And so in order to have a neck that long, they really need a system like this one way so they can fill up those big air sacs in the back of their body and push it through their lungs as they exhale out. And so it's a really neat and efficient system that seems to be necessary. And some bones are hyper elaborate. And so you can see all of these little crosses and supports and struts that come in there. And those are areas where the cavity is enlarging. It's getting bigger and allowing more and more airspace to fill it. So if we take that same vertebra and we cut it in half and we look at it, what we're seeing here is a cross section. And notice all those air spaces within the vertebra. This is actually filled with air. And we know that because this little hole right here, that's one of those pneumatophores. That is one of those air windows that comes from the outside of the vertebra and goes in and fills all the space on the inside of the vertebra. And one thing that does is it reduces the weight of bone by a lot. And so in order to have the super long neck, you don't want to have a whole lot of mass there. So in order to reduce the mass, you can increase the amount of air sacs that are in there. And when the air sacs are filled and become turgid, it really helps hold things together too. So reducing mass and increasing space for air is pretty big deal in sauropods, and one of the reasons that they got to be so big. If we compare the cervical vertebra here, these are a series of cross sections, again, through this vertebra. So we can see at the front side, right through here where it cuts through the ball, where it articulates with the vertebra in front of it. You know, it's this round section here, and it's full of these little round holes or little tube-like structures within it. Even the processes that stick out in front and help articulate or connect up with the vertebra in front and in back are also hollow inside, which is pretty impressive because there's a lot of stresses that go into these bones, but they have enough structural support. And one of the things that came out recently in a study is that the air sacs, whenever they interact with the bone, they can actually resorb. They can basically eat away a little bit of the bone. And then what ends up happening is there's this cool relationship between the stresses. So imagine you have this huge long neck sticking out and you're pulling down on it with gravity. And those stresses actually cause the bone to strengthen in the places that it really needs to be strengthened. And the air sacs can kind of fill in spaces that don't need to be as strong. And so in that way, the bones maintain the strength that they need, but they also can decrease the mass or the amount of bone that is there. So ultimately, all of these spaces, these depressions and these windows into the bone, and the way that the air sacs kind of erode the bone and reshape it as the animal grows, it makes for this huge space for one-way lungs. And that is similar to what we see in their ancestors and their dinosaurs ancestors and dinosaur descendants, so the crocodiles and birds. So looking at this, another aspect of how these bones are shaped as the animal grows, they have this kind of eye structure, this I-beam structure. They're broad and a little bit thicker at the base. They have an internal structure up the middle, and then at the top, another lateral or sideways moving component of the vertebra. This is true of the neck bones, well, all of them, from the neck, the back, and the tail bones, all have cross sections that look like this I-beam type construction. And if we look to construction, look to engineering, you actually see another aspect is these circles, right? And they're basically hollow tubes. And a hollow tube is much, much stronger than a solid tube. And so if we look at these I-beams and tube structures, we see them all throughout the vertebra. And it allows them to, again, reduce their mass, but maintain this extremely rigid structure that keeps it from bending or breaking. So it's really cool that we get to see kind of the same design elements that we put into buildings and bridges are also in these giant sauropod dinosaurs. And so we can look at the neck bone, the series of the neck bone, and we can actually basically connect them together. And what you end up seeing is that the structure, the shape of it is this kind of broader at the base, and then as it goes further and further and further from the legs, this thing is called a cantilever. The cantilever is, it gets narrower, it gets a little bit shorter as it goes further and further away from the point of origin. And that is the same kind of structure that we see in things like cranes or in bridges. And so really, sauropods are basically simple beam and cantilevers. They have a beam in the middle that connects the two legs, and they have two cantilevers as a tail and a head, or a neck and head. So this simple engineering design is actually pretty well models what these giant sauropods are doing, which is kind of neat. So here you go. Here's the beam structure along the middle of the back. We have the two cantilevers going towards the posterior, towards the back of the animal, to the tail, and then one going towards its head. So those structures right there, again, we're seeing them consistently within sauropods. It's the same structure, the same rough shape that we see in giant theropods, the meat-eating dinosaurs. It seems to be a very conserved form within Dinosauria. And one of the reasons that you get to have these huge long necks and huge tails is because of the air sacs that helped invade the bone and make them so much lighter, but at the same time, keeping them very, very strong. And so with that, here is Supersaurus. This is, like I said, the longest animal in North America on land. It's a pretty incredible critter to work with, and I had a whole lot of fun over the years, and it still inspires me to continue on and do the things I do. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and we'll see about opening this up to some questions, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And if you have any questions, it could be about anything on dinosaurs. We can talk about the backbones or whatever you wish. I'll start my video and see if we can stay live here.
Yeah. So Dave, we don't have questions in the chat yet, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what is happening at the Geology Museum these days, where you're excavating, what kind of creatures you're finding.
Absolutely. So right now, our current research program focuses on the Triassic. So if we go back to thinking about the Mesozoic as these three layers, I work on the very bottom layer. And one of the great things about the Triassic is it's the dawn of the dinosaurs. And what we really work on is kind of a complex story, in effect. We're trying to look at, imagine a puzzle. And what we're doing is we're really finding little pieces here and there throughout the Triassic in Wyoming, and we're taking those puzzle pieces and we're trying to build a bigger picture of what's going on. So we might have a small amphibian that we find at this quarry, and that's one piece of the puzzle. It's one piece of evidence. We have some woody material and some plant material, and from that we can get pollen, and that tells us another piece of the puzzle. The rocks themselves tell us something about the environment. It was a river flowing through here, and right next to it is a floodplain that shows evidence of seasonality. So we know that it was wet and dry throughout, depending on the time of the year. We see other amphibians, and all of this we can put together and kind of build a picture of what's going on in the late Triassic of Wyoming. And what's really cool is we found out recently that this happens to be one of the oldest sections of late Triassic rock. Now, what's important about it is late Triassic rocks in North America and really across the world, that's where dinosaurs originated, somewhere within the late Triassic. Wyoming has the oldest of those late Triassic rocks in North America for the continent. And that means animals living on land. There are other rocks that are slightly older that are marine, but they don't really preserve the signal we're looking for, looking at kind of the dawn of the dinosaurs. Now, one of the cool things is that we recently found, I should say, it's been a couple of years now, but we found some bones which were really intriguing. And it turns out that we have the upper leg bone, part of the upper leg bone, and the ankle bone of an animal. And those two bones happen to be the bones we use to diagnose whether an animal is a dinosaur or not. And they have extremely strong dinosaur affinities. And looking at the rest of the bones that we have, it's a handful of bones, so it's not a lot, but there's enough to say that we have a dinosaur. And because it's from Wyoming in the late Triassic, it happens to be one of the oldest dinosaurs, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. And that's an active program that we're working on, along with those other animals that we found, which has been a pretty extensive collection that's keeping us busy trying to understand the amphibians, the amphibian evolution that's happening, and along with the geology and the environment. So again, that whole puzzle, we're putting all these pieces together and starting to build a picture, and we just happen to find a really cool old dinosaur too, which is neat.
That's super.
All right, so
yeah,
we got some questions.
We do. Yeah. So from Anne, Anne says, my son wants to know, what is the smallest dinosaur? So maybe you can take us to the other end of the spectrum.
Absolutely. So one of the smallest dinosaurs that I worked on, and it's among the smallest. It would have been the size of a small crow, or a really big cardinal. So it's a relatively small meat-eating dinosaur. And we know from its bones, specifically from its backbones, that it was a full-grown individual. So as we grow, your bones, like your long bones, they have at the end of the joint, it's a little bit softer when we're younger, and it allows our bones to continue to get longer and bigger. The same is true of dinosaurs. The ends of their bones don't really fuse or completely turn to bone until the animal is old enough, nearing its full size. And the vertebra do the same thing. So those spines that sit on top of on top of the spinal cord, and then that vertebra body that sits below it, those two elements don't fuse together until the animal gets old enough or until it's nearly full grown. And so from the backbones, we can actually tell that the animal is full grown, and it's a relatively small dinosaur. It had a kind of long tail, but the body itself was pretty small. One thing that we've realized as paleontologists is when we're out there looking for fossils, I'll tell you what, it's a whole lot easier to find a sauropod limb bone that has a diameter, it has a cross section all the way across this circle that is bigger than a dinner plate. I mean, these things are gigantic. And so it's easier to find those bones eroding out of a hill than it is to find the bone of a little tiny dinosaur who has a cross section like a pencil. And that would be a big one. So it's hard to find little animals. And most of the little dinosaurs that we find are actually found on accident with bigger dinosaurs. So we're excavating a quarry that might have dozens and dozens of big animals in it, but inadvertently, little animals are going to get caught up too. One of the quarries that the Geology Museum worked in the early 2000s was a sauropod quarry, and within that we have bones of a small little ornithopod dinosaur. So it's one of the bird-hipped dinosaurs, and it's a pretty small guy, and that was found effectively on accident. It was mixed up with the giant bones, and we found a little fish that was like, it got caught up behind in an eddy in the water, behind a huge sauropod limb bone. And so we get things that get trapped in or under these giant bones, and that's how we tend to find the little guys, which is one reason I think we all think of dinosaurs as being gigantic, when in reality, there's probably a huge amount of diversity in small dinosaurs. It's just that we don't find them very much, so they're really rare. It's a good question.
Mm-hmm. That's great. It's the needle in the haystack. Yeah.
That right?
Jackson is wondering about whether or not the air sacs absorbed oxygen like the normal parts of the lungs as well.
Sure. There would be some amount of blood there, but they don't have the same kind of countercurrent exchange with the blood. So clean air running across really thin blood vessels along the edge, they're more of a storage facility for the most part. So they don't have the same kind of oxygen exchange that you would expect within lung tissue itself. And so these animals did have lungs where this oxygen transfer and CO2 transfer back from the blood into the airstream. Where that occurs is always in these lung tissues. And that's where the blood vessels would have been concentrated to have the most air exchange. That's a great question, because if they could get any amount of air exchange across any of those air sacs throughout the body, that would make it even more efficient. At this time, we don't have enough evidence. We don't see that kind of feature as much in birds or crocodiles. And so that's we're making the assumption that they were similar to crocs and birds in that they don't have that kind of air exchange in those surfaces. But it's a great question.
That's great. I'm assuming, well, this is Wednesday night at the lab, wants to know whether or not with this cantilever idea, is the top of the neck under tension and the lower part under compression? Is that the idea there?
That's great. So imagine, if you will, so you have the long base. I wish I could have a whiteboard. I should be able to draw this. What it's basically what they're saying or asking is, right, you have this shape that looks like a little. It's a little longer on the top than the bottom, and what it is that it's pulling on the top, and so there are these big cords. They're tendons. That and ligaments that attach muscle to the bone and bone to bone all the way down the backbone. And as you look at those spines, the spines get bigger and bigger and bigger as you go closer to the body. And what's happening is, as you get further away, there's less of the cantilever out there. And so there's less weight that's pulling down on it. And that downward pull is causing tension on the top. But because things are held tight by these ligaments and these tendons up top, it's holding that tension. The bottom is actually along the base of the vertebra, where the bodies of the vertebra connect together, these ball and sockets. Those are compressing into one another all the way down the vertebral line. So it's actually that long string of tendons that's allowing this thing to hold itself together, in effect. And so it's just by that long string and the compression of those vertebrae into the body is what's really holding it all together.
Mm-hmm. Great. Tony is checking in and making sure Jimbo's at the Wyoming Dinosaur Center, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jimbo is at the Wyoming Dinosaur Center, and Lori is the little dinosaur that we found with Jimbo. And Lori, we just published on 2 years ago now, 2019. Yeah, but Jimbo is at the Wyoming Dinosaur Center.
Mm-hmm.
Good question. Not the Geology Museum.
Right. And the last question here we have in the chat is from Austin, who is wondering whether or not dinosaurs with necks the size of supersaurus required a faster method of swallowing, or did the amount of air stored in them suffice for a long enough time for them to feed? So yeah, how did those systems interact?
It's a great question, and the honest answer is we are still arguing about how that happens. Peristalsis. So basically there's muscles that would move what we call the bolus, or the chunk of food down the esophagus into the stomach or into the crop, where it would undergo digestion. I mean, these animals swallowed rocks that would be the size of my fist. So they're they're different, right? I mean, birds do the same thing. They swallow little rocks and it goes down into their gizzard and their crop, and they start, breaking food particles down, crushing it up a little bit, and as it goes through the digestive tract. Dinosaurs did the same exact thing. So do crocs. And so looking at that, how that moved down the line is really, it's an unknown. We don't have an answer. That's the bottom line. It's a great question, and we just don't know. There are ideas that there are just the muscles are just moving it down. This peristalsis kind of moving stuff down, but they would be able to take a swallow and still breathe. And just like us, if you get that really big chunk of hot dog or whatever you're eating, and it's going slowly down the throat, you can feel it kind of moving down your throat, and you can still breathe because it's past the intersection of the trachea and the esophagus, and it's traveling down the esophagus to your stomach, and then your trachea, you're still able to breathe. So likewise, dinosaurs would have taken a bolus, swallowed, and it's moving down the neck, and the whole time they're breathing. So they probably could have breathed and swallowed at the same time.
What about chewing gum, though?
I know, right? I keep thinking that, but nah, they couldn't chew. They could only close. They could chew once.
So we got one more while you were talking there, and just wondering about, again, thinking about these huge dinosaurs, what did it take for Jimbo to lay down and stand up with such a long neck? How'd that work?
Also a great question. And the answer is probably didn't do much laying down. Theropod dinosaurs would probably would sit down regularly on their pelvic bones. They had a big boot effectively on the bottom that they kind of sit down on, kind of like chickens roosting is what, imagine T-Rex looking like a chicken squatting. It's basically what they would have looked like. Sauropods, it's really thought that they stood on their feet the whole time. We don't find wallow holes. We don't find things that we would associate with large animals doing things on the ground. It would have been very difficult. And part of the reason really goes back to their backbone to some degree, but really to their pelvis, and how the definition of dinosaurs is that it has a hole in the hip, a perforated acetabulum. Remember that. That's the quiz for later. So this hole in the hip, where the femur locks into it, it's that hole that you can see through. The femur goes in, and the animal sits on the femoral head, but there's a hole all the way through. Now the problem is there's also a little lip on the femur, the head of the femur, that locks down into that hole and allows it to move around. But because it's like this, it can't pop out. It's not a ball and socket like in mammals that can move all around. And what ends up happening is, because of that, where it's locked in, it's a very, very strong and supportive element for moving forwards and backwards. But a dinosaur couldn't do the splits. Whereas Scott would say the dinosaurs could only do the splits once.
I love it. Well, I've really enjoyed hearing you talk about these creatures. You and I haven't talked much about supersaurus, even though we've worked together so long.
Right?
So this has been super, and I love all of the questions that have come in and how creative they are. Oh, we got one more here now, and I wonder if this is her son. Excellent. Again. What is the longest dinosaur? So you can wrap us up with the longest dinosaur.
So I'm going to say, so the longest dinosaur is Supersaurus. It is the longest one out there. There are others like Patagoniasaurus that are bigger and much heavier, but Supersaurus has the record for being the longest. It's about 33 meters long, a little over 100 and some odd feet long, which is really big. And so when we made the skeletal mount of that thing, it was pretty awing once we put it all together, and to kind of stand at the base of that thing and try to imagine it walking across a landscape. Just a huge critter, but really cool. Great question. Yeah. And all of them great questions. I look forward to a time that we can all be together and share these kinds of stories in person and engage a little bit more. I really miss that part, so I'm looking forward to that. But I'd like you to take advantage, if you have the time and the bandwidth, to check out some of these other talks. And I think Ben, our host, is going to put that link one more time into the YouTube chat so that you can see that in case you logged in after it was initially posted. So I hope you all have a great rest of the science expeditions. Thanks for joining us to kick this off, and take care, and we'll see you all later. Thanks for your help, Brooke.
You're welcome.